Hello, everyone, and welcome to another segment of Divine Femininity United. I'm your girl, Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee, and we are here for another collective reading. I want to thank you all wherever you are viewing and listening from. We are airing on multiple platforms. We are on the OG Triple OG Clubhouse, and we're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. We're everywhere, you all. So, wherever you are listening from, viewing from. I thank you for your presence, for your energy, for just you being here to join us in this journey through this amazing, absolutely phenomenal book called The Shack. Oh my goodness. If you all have ever seen the movie, then you already know this is good. But as with every other movie that has a book that it was depicted from, the movie does no justice to the book, none whatsoever. The book has so many more details and all types of elements of the story that the movie, having to crunch everything into 2 hours, of course the movie is going to edit some big important chunks that the book can freely give us. And so I'm so grateful to be able to journey with you through this book. We are reading today chapters 4 and 5. Okay, chapters 4 and 5. So far, Mac, our featured focal point here, he already told us about in the prologue and in the first chapter. He already told us about his backstory, about his father being abusive, being an alcoholic pastor. Okay, who also not only abused him but really abused his mom and would beat her until she blacked out, until she was unconscious. That is crazy. And so he endured this until he confessed and he told someone at the church, a youth pastor. Well, the youth pastor received him and made a safe space. However, the youth pastor also had an obligation as being one of the pastoral colleagues to confront the other pastor, i.e., Mack's father. Okay. And so when that happened, Mack's father didn't really particularly like that and sent the mom and the sisters away and tied Mack to a tree where he beat him for 2 days in between drunken stupors. So whenever he would wake up from a drunken, um, slumber, then he would get up and he would resume beating them until he passed out again. And so that happened for 2 full days. And Mac decided, as a young boy, I think he was about 12 at that time, he ran away. He decided that it was time for him to go. He could not help his mom. He couldn't, and that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons why he went to the youth pastor, because he felt like, man, I want to help my mom. I want to help the situation, but I'm too young. I can't. I'm not strong enough. And he felt a sense of guilt. So he went away. He traveled. He had some experiences over life, and he would send money back to his mom by way of his grandparents. That way, his father didn't know that it was coming from him, and it wouldn't be intercepted, and the whole 9 yards. Eventually, Matt's father passed away. Okay, which I'm sure he didn't particularly he wasn't too sad about, you know what I mean? So he passed away, and Mac ended up, growing older. He got a wife of his own. Her name is Nanette, but Nan for short. And then they have 5 children, 3 of which are out of the house now, and 2 were at home. No, 2 were out of the house and 3 were at home. And so the author, because Mac wasn't quite good with his words or writing, so the author William Young, he was the one that put it to words and put it on paper. And so William stated that he would go into the youngest child, Missy, deeper in the story. So, and I wonder why, because in the prologue, he really detailed what the other children were up to. The 2 were going off to college and this, and then the third. I mean, he really spelled it out. And then when he got to Missy, the youngest, he was like, well, she's an interesting one, but we'll get into that later. And I was like, okay, right? So they went into the whole process of, Mac receiving this anonymous letter from the mailbox, hey, Mac, I miss you. It's been a long time. And, if you want to meet up, I'll be at the shack. and I love you, and it was signed Papa. Well, apparently something happened at the shack. We haven't gotten to the shack yet, okay? We haven't gotten to the significance of the shack, but something about this shack angered Mack, angered him. And this note that came in the mailbox, it had no return address. It was not stamped. And again, his father had already passed away. So who was playing this cruel joke on him? That's what he was trying to figure out. And he was talking about how, okay, trying to think it over, like what is going on, all of this stuff. Well, he ended up, it was an icy day. He ended up slipping on the ice. He, knocked himself out cold, and had a gash in the back of his head, a really bad gash. And while he was in and out of sleep and concussion, I'm assuming, he was dreaming about what he would call the great sadness. He never went into the details of the great sadness. And so today, chapter 4 is entitled The Great Sadness. Okay. So chapter 3 also talked about how, chapter 2 and 3 talked about how he took the last remembrance prior to the Great Sadness. He took his kids to a camping trip the last weekend before they were to start their next school year. And the wife went off to a conference. She's a nurse, but she went out to a conference, and then he wanted to spend time with their son and their two daughters. And the last thing that we left off with was when the son and the daughter, they were canoeing. This was as they were packing up to return back home. They were canoeing, and the canoe flipped over, and the son's life vest got caught on some coral in the water where he couldn't get himself back up. And Mack ended up having to go down there and retrieve his son. Thankfully, his son did not die. And in the commotion, all of the other campers that came around, and they were trying to assist, and they were all crying and things like that, in appreciation and gratitude that the son did not die. And the last line of the previous chapter was, a potential crisis had been averted. And then it said, or so Mack thought. Okay. That was the end of chapter 3. Now we're on chapter 4. And that is the one, like I said, that is entitled The Great Sadness. Okay. Ooh. So that last chapter was already, it had me on pins and needles, right? But I'm like, oh my goodness, what could the great sadness be? So here we go. If at any point you all hear something in the story that I'm reading that is like, oh my goodness, I want to share or whatever, then go ahead and share. The chat and the comment sections is there for a reason. Utilize it, share your thoughts and things like that. I will every so often I'll go back and forth from the book to the screen to see exactly who's saying what, if you said anything, or if you want to just listen, then feel free to just listen. But here we go. Chapter 4, The Great Sadness. There's a quote by Khalil Gibran that states, sadness is a wall between two gardens. Sadness is a wall between two gardens. Max stood on the shore, doubled over and still trying to catch his breath. It took a few minutes before he even thought about Missy, remembering that she had been coloring in her book at the table. He walked up to the bank to where he could see the campsite, but there was no sign of her. His pace quickened as he hurried to the tent trailer, calling her name as calmly as he could manage. No response. She was not there. Even though his heart skipped a beat, he rationalized that in the confusion someone had seen her, probably Sarah Madison or Vicky Doucette or one of the older kids. Not wanting to appear over anxious or panicky, he found and soberly informed his two new friends that he couldn't find Missy and asked if they would each check their families. Both quickly headed off to their respective campsites. Jesse returned first to announce that Sarah had not seen Missy at all that morning. He and Mack then headed for the Doucette site, but before they reached it, Emil came hurrying towards them, a look of apprehension written clearly on his face. No one has seen Missy today, and we don't know where Amber is either. Maybe they're together. There was a hint of dread in Emil's question. I'm sure that's it, said Mack, trying to reassure himself and Emil at the same time. Where do you think they might be? Why don't we check the bathrooms and showers, suggested Jesse. Good idea, said Mack. I'll check the one nearest our site, the one my kids use. Why don't you and Emil check the one between your sites? They nodded, and Mac headed at a slow trot toward the closest showers, noticing for the first time that he was barefoot and shirtless. What a sight I must be, he thought, and probably would have chuckled if his mind wasn't so focused on Missy. Arriving at the restrooms, he asked a teenager emerging from the women's section if she had seen a little girl in a red dress inside, or maybe two girls. She told him that she hadn't noticed but would look again. In less than a minute, she was back shaking her head. Thank you anyway, said Mac, and headed around the back of the building where the showers were located. As he rounded the corner, he began calling loudly for Missy. Mac could hear water running, but no one responded. Wondering if Missy might be in one of the showers, he began pounding on each until he got a response. He succeeded only in severely scarring a poor elderly lady when his door banging accidentally opened her shower stall. She shrieked, and Mac, with profuse apologies, quickly shut the door and hurried on to the next one. 6 shower stalls and no Missy. He checked the men's toilet stalls and showers, trying not to think about why he would even bother looking there. She was nowhere, and he jogged back towards Emil's, unable to pray anything except, "Oh God, help me find her. Oh God, please help me find her." When she saw him, Vicky rushed to meet him. She had been trying not to cry, but couldn't help it as they embraced. Suddenly, Mac desperately wanted Nan to be there. She would know what to do, at least what the right thing was. He felt so lost. Sarah has Josh and Kate back at your campsite, so don't worry about them, Vicky told him between sobs. Oh God, Mac thought, having totally forgotten about his other two. What kind of father am I? Although he was relieved that Sarah had them, he now wished even more that Nan was here. Just then, Emil and Jesse burst into camp. Emil appearing relieved and Jesse looking as tense as a wound up spring. We found her, exclaimed Emil. His face lightened up, then turning somber as he realized what he had implied. I mean, we found Amber. She just came back from taking a shower at this other place that still had hot water. She said she told her mom, but Vicky probably didn't hear her. His voice trailed off. But we didn't find Missy. Jesse added quickly, answering the most important question. Amber hadn't seen her today either. Emil, all business now, took charge. Mac, we need to contact the campground authorities immediately and get the word out to find Missy. Maybe in the ruckus and excitement, she got scared and confused and just wandered away and got lost, or maybe she was trying to find us and took a wrong turn. Do you have a picture of her? Maybe there's a copy machine at the office, and we could make a few copies and save some time. Yes, I have a snapshot of her in my wallet. He reached for his back pocket and for a second panic as he found nothing there. The thought flashed through his mind as his wallet sitting at the bottom of Wallowa Lake, and then he remembered that it was still in his van after yesterday's trip up the tram. The three headed back to Mack's site. Jesse ran ahead and let Sarah know that Amber was safe, but that Missy's whereabouts were still unknown. Arriving at camp, Mack hugged and encouraged Josh and Kate as best he could, trying to appear calm for their sakes. Changing out of his wet clothes, he threw on a t-shirt and jeans, some clean dry socks, and a pair of running shoes. Sarah promised that she and Vicky would keep his older two with him, and whispered that she was praying for him and Missy. Mac gave her a quick hug and thanked her, and after kissing his children, joined the other two men as together they jogged toward the campground office. Word of the water rescue had reached the little two-room camp headquarters ahead of them, and everyone there was in high spirits. This changed quickly as the three took turns explaining Missy's disappearance. Fortunately, the office had a photocopier, and Mac enlarged half a dozen pictures of Missy, handing them around. The Wallowa Lake campground has 215 sites, divided into 5 loops and 3 group areas. The young assistant manager, Jeremy Bellamy, volunteered to help canvass, as they divided the camp into 4 areas and each headed out armed with a map, Missy's picture, and an office walkie-talkie. One assistant with a walkie-talkie also went back to Mac's site to report in if Missy turned up there. It was slow, methodical work, but too slow, much too slow for Mac. But he knew that this was the most logical way to find her if she was still on the campgrounds. As he walked between tents and trailers, he was praying and promising. He knew in his heart that promising things to God was rather dumb and irrational, but he couldn't help it. He was desperate to get Missy back, and surely God knew where she was. Many campers were either not at their sites or in the final stages of packing up to head home. No one, he asked, had seen Missy or anyone looking like her. Periodically, the search parties checked in with the office to get an update on the progress, if any, that each was making. Nothing at all until almost 2 in the afternoon. Mack was finishing his section when the call came in on the walkie-talkies. Jeremy, who had taken the area nearest the entrance, thought he had something. Emil instructed them to put a mark on their maps showing where he had left off, and then he gave them the site number where Jeremy had called from. Mack was the last to arrive, and he walked in on an intense conversation involving Emil, Jeremy, and a third young man that Mack did not recognize. Emil quickly brought Mack up to speed, introducing him to Virgil Thomas, a city boy from California, who had been camping all summer in an area with some buddies. Virgil and his friends had crashed after partying last night into the night, and he had been the only one up who saw an old military green truck heading out the entrance and down the road toward Joseph. About what time was that? Mack asked. Like I told him, Virgil said, pointing his thumb to Jeremy. It was before noon. I'm not sure how much before noon though. I was kind of hungover and we really hadn't been paying much attention to clocks since we got here. Pushing the picture of Missy in front of the young man, Mack asked sharply, do you think you saw her? When the other fellow first showed me the picture, she didn't look familiar, Virgil answered, looking again at the photo. But then, when he said that she was wearing a bright red dress, I remembered the little girl in the green truck and was wearing red, and she was either laughing or bellowing. I couldn't really tell. And then it looked like the guy slapped her and pushed her down. But I suppose he could have been just playing too. Mack felt paralyzed. The information was overwhelming to him, but unfortunately, it was the only thing they had heard that made any sense. It explained why they found no trace of Missy, but everything in him didn't want it to be true. He turned and started to run toward the office, but he was halted by Emil's voice. Mack, stop. We've already radioed the office and contacted the sheriff and Joseph. They're sending someone here right away, and you're putting out an APB on the truck. As he finished speaking, as if on cue, 2 patrol cars pulled into the campgrounds. The first headed directly for the office, while the other turned into the section where they all stood waiting. Mack waved the officer down and hurried to meet him as he emerged from his vehicle. A young man who looked to be in his late 20s introduced himself as Officer Dalton and began taking their statements. The next hours saw a massive escalation in response to Missy's disappearance. An all points bulletin was sent out as far west as Portland, east to Boise, Idaho, and north to Spokane, Washington. Police officers in Joseph set up a roadblock in the Imnaha Highway, which led out of Joseph and deeper into the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area. If the child stealer had taken Missy up the Imnaha, only one of many directions he could have gone. The police figured they could get pertinent information by questioning those coming out. Their resources were limited, and rangers in the area were also contacted to be on the lookout. The Phillips' campsite was cordoned off as a crime scene, and everyone in the vicinity was questioned. Virgil offered as much detail as he could about the truck and its occupants, and the resulting description was flashed out to all relevant agencies. The FBI field offices in Portland, Seattle, and Denver were put on notice. Nan had been called and was on her way, being driven by her best friend, Marianne. Even tracking dogs were brought in, but Missy's trail ended in the nearby parking lot, increasing the likelihood that Virgil's story was accurate. After forensic specialists had combed through the campsite, Officer Dalton asked Mack to re-enter the area and carefully look to see if anything was out of place or different than he remembered. Although already exhausted by the emotions of the day, Mack was desperate to do anything to help and deliberately focus his mind to try and remember whatever he could about the morning. Cautiously, so as not to disturb anything, he retraced his steps. What he could give what he would give for a do-over, a chance to have this day start from the beginning. Even if he burned his fingers and dropped the pancake batter all over again, if only he could take it back. Again, he turned back to his assigned task, but nothing seemed to be different than what he remembered. Nothing had changed. He came to the table where Missy had been busy. The book was open to the page she had been coloring, a half finished picture of the Multnomah Indian princess. The crayons were also there, although Missy's favorite color, red, was missing. He began to look around on the ground to see where it might have fallen. If you're looking for the red crayon, we found it over there by the tree, said Dalton, pointing toward the parking lot. She probably dropped it when she was struggling with. His voice trailed off. How can you tell she was struggling? Mack demanded. The officer hesitated, but then spoke, almost reluctantly. We found one of her shoes near there, in the bushes, where it was probably kicked off. You weren't here at the time, so we asked your son to identify it. The image of his daughter fighting off some perverted monster was like a fist to the stomach, almost succumbing to the sudden blackness and threatened to smother him. Mack leaned on the table to keep from passing out or throwing up. It was then he noticed a ladybug pen sticking in the coloring book. He snapped to awareness as if someone had opened smelling salts under his nose. Whose is that? He asked Dalton, pointing to the pen. Whose is what? This ladybug pen. Who put that there? We just assumed it was Missy's. Are you telling me that pen was not there this morning? I'm positive, asserted Mack adamantly. She doesn't own anything like that. I am absolutely positive that it was not here this morning. Officer Dalton was already on his radio, and within minutes, forensics was back and had taken the pen into custody. Dalton took Mack aside and explained, if what you say is correct, then we have to assume that Missy's assailant left it here on purpose. He paused before adding, Mr. Phillips, this could be good news or bad. I don't understand, responded Mack. The officer again hesitated, trying to decide whether he should tell Mack what he was thinking. He searched for the right words. Well, the good news is that we might get some evidence of it. It's the only thing we have so far linking him to the scene. And the bad news? Mack held his breath. Well, the bad news, and I'm not saying that this is the case here, but guys who leave something like this usually have a purpose in leaving it, and it usually means that they have done this before. What are you saying? Mack snapped. That this guy is some kind of serial killer? Is this some sort of mark that he leaves behind to identify himself? Like he is marking his territory or something? Mack was getting angry, and it was evident by the look on Dalton's face that he was sorry for even mentioning it. But before Mack could blow, Dalton received an incoming call on his belt radio, patching him through to the FBI field office in Portland, Oregon. Mack refused to leave and listen as a woman identified herself as a special agent. She asked Dalton to describe the pen in detail. Mack followed the officer to where the forensic team had set up a work area. The pen was secured inside a Ziploc bag, and standing just behind the group, he eavesdropped as Dalton described it as best he could. It's a ladybug stick pen that was stuck through some pages of a coloring book. This one, it's like one of those pins a woman would wear on her lapel, I think. Please describe the colors and the number of dots on the ladybug, directed the voice on the radio. Let's see, said Dalton, with his eyes almost up to the pouch. The head is black with a ladybug head, and the body is red with black edges and divisions. There are 2 black dots on the left side of the body as you look down from above, with the head at the top. Does that make sense? Perfectly. Please go on, the voice said patiently. And on the right side of the ladybug, there are 3 dots, so 5 in all. There was a pause. Are you sure there are 5 dots? Yes, ma'am, there are 5 dots. He looked up and saw Mack, who had moved to the other side to see better. made eye contact, and shrugged his shoulders as if to indicate, who cares how many dots? Okay, now, Officer Dabney, Dalton, ma'am, Tommy Dalton. He looked at Mack again and rolled his eyes. Sorry, Officer Dalton, would you please turn over the pen and tell me what is on the bottom or underside of the ladybug? Dalton turned the pouch over and looked carefully. There's something here engraved on the bottom, special agent. I didn't get your name exactly. Wachowski, spelled just like it sounds. Is it some letters or numbers? Well, let me see. Yeah, I think you're right. It looks like some kind of model number. CK 146, I believe. Yeah, Charlie Kilo 146. It's tough to make out through the baggie. There was silence on the other end. Mack whispered to Dalton, ask her why or what that means. Dalton hesitated and then complied. Again, there was an extended silence on the other side. Wachowski, are you there? Yeah, I'm here. Suddenly the voice sounded tired and hollow. Hey, Dalton, are you someplace private where we can talk? Mack nodded with exaggeration, and Dalton got the message. Hold on a sec. He put down the pouch with the pen and moved outside the area, allowing Mack to follow. Dalton was already way beyond protocol with him anyway. Yep, I am now. So tell me, what's the scoop on this ladybug? He inquired. We've been trying to catch this guy for almost 4 years, tracking him across more than 9 states now. He's been continually moving west. He's been nicknamed the little lady killer. But we have never released the ladybug detail to the press or anyone else. So please keep that on the down low. We believe he's responsible for abducting and killing at least 4 children so far, all girls, all under the age of 10. Each time he adds a dot to the ladybug, so this would be number 5. He always leaves the same pin somewhere at the kidnap scene, all with the same model number, like he bought a box of them. But we've had no luck tracking down where they originally came from. We haven't found one of the bodies of any of those 4 little girls. And although forensics has come up with nothing, we have good reason to believe that none of the girls have survived. Every crime has taken place at or near a camping area, with a state park or reserve close by. The perpetrator seems to be an expert woodsman and mountaineer. In every case, he has left us absolutely nothing except the pen. What about the car? We have a pretty good description of the green truck he left in. Oh, you'll probably find it all right. If this is our guy, it will have been stolen a day or 2 ago, repainted full of outdoor gear, and it will be wiped clean. As he listened to Dalton's conversation with Special Agent Wachowski, Mack felt the last of his hope draining away. He slumped to the ground and buried his face in his hands. Was there ever a man as tired as he was at this moment? For the first time since Missy's disappearance, he allowed himself to consider the range of horrendous possibilities, and once it started, he couldn't stop. The imaginations of good and evil all mixed up together in a soundless but terrifying parade. Even when he tried to shake free of the images, he couldn't. Some were horrible, ghastly snapshots of torture and pain, of monsters and demons of the deepest dark with barbed wire fingers and razor touches, of Missy screaming for her daddy and no one answering. And mixed throughout these horrors were flashes of other memories. The toddler with her Missy sippy cup, as they called it too. The 2-year-old drunk from eating too much chocolate cake. And the one image so recently made as she fell asleep safely in her dad's arms. Unyielding images. What would he say at her funeral? What would he possibly say to Nan? How could this have happened? God, how could this have happened? A few hours later, Mack and his 2 children drove to the hotel in Joseph that had become the staging areas for the growing search. The proprietors had kindly offered them a complimentary room as he moved a few of his things into it. His exhaustion began to get the better of him. He had gratefully accepted Officer Dalton's offer to take his children down to a local diner for some food, and now sitting down on the edge of the bed, he was swept helplessly away in the unrelenting and merciless grip of growing despair. Slowly rocking back and forth, soul shredding sobs and groans clawed to the surface from the core of his being. And that is how Nan found him. Two broken lovers, they had held each other and wept as Mack poured out his sorrow and Nan tried to hold him in one piece. That night, Mack slept in fits and starts as the images continued to pound him, like relentless waves on a rocky shore. Finally, he gave up, just before the sun began to issue hints of its arrival. He hardly noticed. In one day, he had spent a year's worth of emotions, and now he felt numb, adrift in a suddenly meaningless world that felt like it would be forever gray. After considerable protest from Nan, they agreed it would be best for her to head home with Josh and Kate. Mack would remain to help in any way he could and to be close just in case. He simply couldn't leave, not when she might still be out there, needing him. Word had quickly spread, and friends arrived to help him pack up the site and cart everything back to Portland. His boss called, offering any support he could and encouraging Mack to stay as long as he needed. Everyone they knew was praying. Reporters, with their photographers in tow, began showing up during the morning. Mack didn't want to face them or their cameras, but after some coaching, he spent time answering their questions in the parking lot, knowing the exposure could go a long way to help in the search for Missy. He had kept quiet about Officer Dalton overstepping his protocol, and Dalton returned the favor by keeping him inside the information loop. Jesse and Sarah, willing to do anything, made themselves constantly available to the family and friends who came to help. They lifted the huge burden of communication with the public from both Nan and Mack and seemed to be everywhere as they skillfully wove some threads of peace into the turbulence of emotions. Emile Doucette's parents arrived after driving all the way from Denver to help Vicky and the kids get home safely. Emile, with the blessing of his superiors, had decided to stay behind to do what he could with the park service to help Mack stay informed on that side of things. Nan, who had bonded quickly with both Sarah and Vicky, had distracted herself by helping with little JJ and then getting her own two children ready for their trip back to Portland. And when she broke down, as she frequently did, Vicky and Sarah was always there to weep and pray with her. It became clear that the need for their assistance was winding down. The Madisons packed up their own site and then came by for a teary farewell before heading north. As Jesse gave Mack a long hug, he whispered that they would see each other again and that he would be in prayer for all of them. Sarah, tears rolling down her cheeks, simply kissed Mack on the forehead and then held on to Nan, who again broke into sobs and moans. Sarah sang something, words Mack couldn't quite hear, but it calmed his wife until she was steady enough to let Sarah go. Mack couldn't even bear to watch as the couple finally walked away. As the Doucettes ready to go, Mack took a minute to thank Amber and Emmy for comforting and reaching out to his own, especially when he couldn't. Josh cried his goodbyes. He wasn't brave anymore, at least not today. Kate, on the other hand, had become a rock, busying herself making sure that everyone had everyone else's addresses and emails. Vicky's world had been shaken by the events, and now she had to be almost pried from Nan as her own grief threatened to sweep her away. Nan held her, stroking her hair and whispering prayers into her ear until she was settled enough to walk to the waiting car. By noon, all of the families were on the road. Mary Ann drove Nan and the kids home, where family would be waiting to care for and comfort them. Mack and Emile joined Officer Dalton, who was now just Tommy, and headed into Tommy's patrol car. There, they grabbed sandwiches, which were barely touched, and then drove to the police station. Tommy Dalton was the father of two daughters himself, his oldest being only 5, so it was easy to see that this case struck a particular nerve with him. He extended every kindness and courtesy he could to his new friends, especially Mack. Now came the hardest part waiting. Mack felt like he was moving in slow motion inside the eye of a hurricane of activity happening all around him. Reports filtered in from everywhere. Even Emile was busy networking with the people and professionals he knew. The FBI entourage arrived mid-afternoon from field offices in 3 cities. It was clear from the start that the person in charge was Special Agent Wachowski, a small, slim woman who was all fire and motion, and to whom Mack took an instant liking. She publicly returned the favor, and from that moment on, no one questioned his presence at even the most intimate of conversations or debriefings. After setting up their command center at the hotel, the FBI asked Mack to come in for a formal interview, something they insisted as routine in these kinds of circumstances. Agent Rakowski rose from behind the desk she was working at and held out her hand. As he reached for the handshake, she clasped both her hands around his and smiled grimly. Mr. Phillips, I apologize that I haven't been able to spend much time with you so far. We've been frantically busy setting up communications with all the law enforcement and other agencies involved in trying to get Missy back safely. I'm so sorry that we have to meet under such circumstances. Mack believed her. Mack, he said. I beg your pardon? Mack, please call me Mack. Well, Mack, then please call me Sam, short for Samantha. But I grew up kind of a tomboy and beat up the kids who would dare call me Samantha to my face. I couldn't help but smile, relaxing a little into the chair as he watched her quickly sort through a couple of folders full of papers. Mack, are you up for a few questions? She asked him without looking up. I'll do my best, he answered, grateful for the opportunity to do anything. Good. I won't take much. I won't make you walk through all the details again. I have the reports on everything that you told the others, but I have a couple of important things to go over with you. She looked up, making eye contact. Anything I can do to help, confessed Mack. I'm feeling very useless at this moment. Mack, I understand how you feel, but your presence here is important. And believe me, there's not a person here who doesn't care about your Missy. We will do everything in our power to get her back safely. Thank you, was all Mack could say, and he looked down at the floor. Emotion seemed so near the surface, and even the least bit of kindness seemed to poke holes in his reserve. Okay, now, I've had a good off the record talk with your friend, Officer Tommy, and he filled me in on everything that you and he have talked about. So don't feel like you have to protect his butt. He's all right in my book. Mack looked up and nodded and smiled again at her. So, she continued, have you noticed anything strange around your family these past few days? Mack was surprised and sat back in his chair. You mean he's been stalking us? No, he seems to choose his victims at random, though they were all about the age of your daughter with similar hair color. We think he spots them a day or two before and waits and watches from nearby for an opportune moment. Have you seen anyone unusual or out of place near the lake? Perhaps near the bathrooms? Mack recoiled at the thought of his children being watched, being targets. He tried to think past his own imagination, but came up blank. I'm sorry, not that I can remember. Did you stop anywhere on your way to the campgrounds or notice anyone strange when you were hiking or sightseeing in the area? We stopped at Multnomah Falls on the way here, and we've been all over the area the past 3 days. But I don't recall seeing anyone who looked out of the ordinary. Who would have thought? Exactly, Mack. So don't beat yourself up. Something may come to mind later. No matter how small or irrelevant it might seem, please let us know. She paused to look at another paper on her desk. What about a green military truck? Have you noticed anything like that around while you were here? Mack raked his memory. I really can't remember seeing anything like that. Special Agent Rakowski continued to question Mack for the next 15 minutes, but could not jar his memory enough to provide anything helpful. She finally closed her notebook and stood, extending her hand. Mack, again, I'm so sorry about Missy. If anything breaks, I will personally let you know the minute it happens. At 5 p.m., the first promising report finally came in from the Amnaha roadblock. As she had promised, Agent Rolkowski immediately sought out Mack and filled him in on the details. Two couples had encountered a green military-looking truck matching the description of the vehicle nearby everyone was searching for. They had been exploring some old Nez Perce sites off of National Forest 4260 in one of the more remote areas of the National Reserve. And on their way out, they had come face to face with the vehicle just south of the junction where NF 426A and NF 250 split. Because that section of road was basically one lane, they had to back up to a safe space to allow the truck to pass. They noticed that the pickup had a number of gas cans in the back, plus a fair amount of camping gear. The odd part was that the man had bent over toward his passenger side as if looking for something on the floor, pulled his hat down low, and wore a big coat in the heat of the day, almost as if he were afraid of them. They had just laughed it off as one of those militia freaks. The instant the report was announced to the group, tensions in the station increased. Tommy came over to let Mac know that unfortunately everything he had learned so far fit the little lady killer's MO, to head for a remote area out of which he could eventually hike. It was obvious that he knew where he was going, as the locale where he had been spotted was well off the beaten path. Unlucky for him that someone else had been so far out there as well. With evening quickly approaching, an intense discussion began regarding the efficacy of immediate pursuit or holding off until daybreak. Regardless of their point of view, it seemed that everyone who spoke was deeply affected by the situation. Something in the heart of most human beings simply cannot abide pain inflicted on the innocent, especially children. Even broken men serving in the worst correlation facilities will often first take out their own rage on those who have caused suffering to children. Even in such a world of relative morality, causing harm to children is still considered absolutely wrong, period. Standing near the back of the room, Mac listened impatiently to what seemed like time wasting bickering. He was almost ready to kidnap Tommy if he had if he had to go and if he had to and go after the guy himself. It felt like every second counted. Although it certainly felt longer to Mac, the various departments and personalities agreed quickly and unanimously to set out in pursuit just as soon as a few arrangements could be made. Although there wasn't many ways to drive out of the area and roadblocks were being set up immediately to prevent this, there was a very real concern that a skilled hiker could pass undetected into the Idaho wilderness to the east or Washington state to the north. While officials in the towns of Lewistown, Idaho and Clarkston, Washington were being contacted and notified of the situation, Matt quickly called Nan to give her an update and then left with Tommy. By now, he had only one prayer left. Dear God, please, please, please take care of my Missy. I just can't right now. Tears traced their way down his cheek and then spilled off onto his shirt. At 7:30 p.m., the convoy of patrol cars, FBI SUVs, pickups with dogs and kennels, and some ranger vehicles headed up the Amnaha Highway. Instead of turning east onto the Wallowa Mountain Road, which would have taken them directly into the National Reserve, they stayed on the Amnaha and headed north. Eventually, they took the lower Amnaha Road and finally dug Bar Road into the reserve. Mac was glad he was traveling with someone who knew the area. It seemed at times that Dugbar Road went in all directions simultaneously. It was almost as if whoever had named these roads had run out of ideas, or simply got tired or drunk, or began naming everything Dugbar just as he could go home, just so he could go home. The roads with frequent narrow switchbacks, edging steep drop offs, became even more treacherous in the pitch dark of the night. Progress slowed to a crawl. Finally, they passed the point where the green pickup had last been seen, and a mile later came to the junction where NF4260 went further northeast and NF250 headed southwest. There, as planned, the caravan split into two, with a small group heading north up the 4260 with Special Agent Wachowski, while the rest, including Mac, Emil, and Tommy, went southeast on the 250. A few difficult miles later, this larger group split again. Tommy and a dog truck continuing down the 250, where, according to the maps, the road would end, and the rest taking the more easterly route through the park of NF 4240 down toward the Temperance Creek area. At this point, all search efforts slowed even more. The trackers were now on foot and backed up by powerful floodlights while they looked for signs and recent activity on the roads. Anything that might suggest the particular area they were examining was something other than a dead end. Almost 2 hours later, and moving at a snail's pace toward the end of 250, a call came in to Dalton from Wachowski. Her team had caught a break about 10 miles from the junction where they were separated. An old unnamed road left the 4260 and headed straight north for almost 2 miles. It was barely visible and deeply potted. They would either have missed it entirely or ignored it, except the one of the trackers had flashed his floodlight off a hubcap less than 50 feet from the main road. Out of curiosity, he retrieved it, and under the covering of road dust found it splattered with specks of green paint. The hubcap had probably been lost when the truck had tussled with one of the many deep potholes strewn in that direction. Tommy's group immediately turned back the way they had come. Mack didn't want to let himself begin to hope that perhaps by some miracle Missy might still be alive, especially when everything he knew told him otherwise. 20 minutes later, another call from Wachowski, this time to tell them they had found the truck. Choppers had searched planes Choppers and search planes would never have seen it from the sky, covered as it was under a carefully built lean to of limbs and bushes. It took Mack's crew almost 3 hours to reach the first team, and by then it was all over. The dogs had done the rest, uncovering a descending game trail that led more than a mile into a small hidden valley. They found a rundown little shack near the edge of the pristine lake, barely half a mile across, fed by a cascading creek 100 yards away. A century or so earlier, this had probably been a settler's home. It had two good sized rooms, enough to house a small family. Since that time, it had most likely served as an occasional hunter's or poacher's cabin. By the time Mack and his friends arrived, the sky was beginning to show the grays of pre-dawn. A base camp a base camp had been set up well away from the battered little cabin in order to preserve the crime scene. The moment Wachowski's group had found the place, dog trackers had been sent out in different directions to try and locate a scent. Occasionally, the baying indicated that they had found something, only to have it disappear again. Now they were all returning to regroup and plan the day's strategies. Special Agent Samantha Wachowski was sitting at a card table doing some map work and drinking a large dripping water of bottle of water when Mack walked up. She offered him a grim smile, which he didn't return, and an extra bottle, which he accepted. Her eyes were sad and tender, but her words were all business. Hey Mack, she hesitated. Why don't you pull up a chair? Mack didn't want to sit. He needed to do something to stop his stomach from churning. Sensing trouble, he stood and waited for her to continue. Mack, we found something, but it's not good news. He fumbled for the right words. Did you find Missy? It was the question he didn't want to hear the answer to, but desperately needed to know. No, we didn't find her. Sam paused and started to stand up. But I do need you to come and identify something we found down in that little old shack. I need to know if it was, she called herself, but it was too late. I mean, if it is hers. His gaze went to the ground. He again felt a million years old, almost wishing he could somehow turn himself into a big, unfeeling rock. Oh, Mac, I'm so sorry. Sam apologized, standing up. Look, we can do this later if you like. I just thought he couldn't look at her and even found it difficult to come up with words that he could speak without falling apart. He could feel like he could feel the dam about to burst again. Let's do it now, he mumbled softly. I want to know everything there is to know. Wachowski must have signaled the others because although Mac didn't hear anything, he suddenly felt Emil and Tommy each take one of his arms as they turned and followed the special agent down the short path to the shack. Three young men, arms locked in some special grace of solidarity, walking together, each one toward his own worst nightmare. A member of the forensic team opened the door of the shack to let them in. Generator powered lighting illuminated every part of the main house. Shelving lined with walls, an old table, a few chairs, and an old sofa that someone had hauled in with no little effort. Mack immediately saw what he had come to identify and, turning, crumpled into the arms of his two friends and began to weep uncontrollably. On the floor by the fireplace lay Missy's torn and blood soaked red dress. For Mack, the next few days and weeks became an emotional, numbing blur of interviews with law enforcement and the press, followed by a memorial service for Missy with a small empty coffin and an endless sea of faces, all sad as they paraded by, no one knowing what to say. Sometime during the weeks that followed, Mack began the slow and painful merging back into everyday life. The little lady killer, it seemed, was accredited with taking his fifth victim, Melissa Ann Phillips. As was true in the other four cases, authorities never recovered Missy's body, even though search teams had scoured the forest around the shack for days after its discovery. As in every other instance, the killer had left no fingerprints and no DNA. He left no useful evidence anywhere, only the pen. It was as if the man were a ghost. At some point in the process, Mack attempted to emerge from his own pain and grief, at least with his family. They had lost a sister and daughter, but it could be wrong. It would be wrong for them to lose a father and husband as well. Although no one involved was left unmarked by the tragedy, Kate seemed to have been affected the most, disappearing into a shell, like a turtle protecting its soft underbelly from anything potentially dangerous. It seemed that she would only poke her head out when she felt fully safe, which was becoming less and less often. Mack and Nan both worried increasingly about her, but couldn't seem to find the right words to penetrate the fortress she was building around her heart. Attempts at conversation would turn into one-way monologues, with sounds bouncing off her stone visage. It was as if something had died inside her and now was slowly infecting her from the inside, spilling out occasionally in bitter words or emotionless silence. Josh fared much better, due in part to the long distance relationship he had kept up with Amber. Email and the telephone gave him an outlet for his pain, and she had given him the time and space to grieve. He was also preparing to graduate from high school with all the distractions that his senior year provided. The great sadness had descended and, in differing degrees, cloaked everyone whose lives had touched Missy's. Mack and Nan weathered the storm of loss together with reasonable success, and in some ways were closer for it. Nan had made it clear from the start, and repeatedly, that she did not blame Mack in any way for what happened. Understandably, it took Mack much longer to let himself off the hook, even a little bit. It is so easy to get sucked into the if only game and playing it as a short and slippery slide into despair. If only he had decided not to take the kids onto the trip. If only he had said no when they asked to use the canoe. If only he had left the day before. If only, if only, if only. And then to have it all end with nothing. The fact that he was unable to bury Missy's body magnified his failure as a father. That she was still out there somewhere alone in the forest haunted him every day. Now, 3.5 years later, Missy was officially presumed to have been murdered. Life would never be normal again. Not that any time is really ever normal. It would be so empty without his Missy. The tragedy had also increased the rifts in Mack's own relationship with God, but he ignored this growing sense of separation. Instead, he tried to embrace a stoic, unfeeling faith, and even though Mack found some comfort and peace in that, it didn't stop the nightmares where his feet were stuck in the mud and his soundless screams could not save his precious Missy. The bad dreams were becoming less frequent, and laughter and moments of joy were slowly returning, but he felt guilty about these. So when Mack received the note from Papa telling him to meet him back at the shack, it was no small event. Does God even write notes? And why the shack, the icon of his deepest pain? Certainly God would have better places to meet with him. A dark thought even crossed his mind that the killer could be taunting him or luring him away to leave the rest of his family unprotected. Maybe it was all just a cruel hoax. But then why was it signed Papa? Try as he might, Mack could not escape the desperate possibility that the note just might be from God after all, even if the thought of God passing notes did not fit well with his theological training. In seminary, he had been taught that God had completely stopped any overt communication with moderns, preferring to have them only listen to and follow sacred scripture, probably interpreted, of course. God's voice had been reduced to paper, and even that paper had to be moderated and deciphered by the proper authorities and intellects. It seemed that direct communication with God was something exclusively for the ancients and uncivilized, while educated Westerners was access to God was mediated and controlled by the intelligentsia. Nobody wanted God in a box, just in a book, especially an expensive one bound in leather with gilt edges, or was that gilt edges? The more Mac thought about it, the more confused and irritated he became. Who sent the damn note? Whether it was God or the killer or some prankster, what did it matter? Whichever way he looked at it, it felt like he was being toyed with. And anyway, what good was following God at all? Look where it got him. But in spite of his anger and desperation, Mac knew that he needed some answers. He realized he was stuck, and Sunday prayers and hymns weren't cutting it anymore, if they ever really had. Cloistered spirituality seemed to change nothing in the lives of the people he knew, except maybe Nan. But she was special. God might really love her. She wasn't a screw up like him. He was sick of God and God's religion, sick of all the little religious social clubs that didn't seem to make any real difference or affect any real changes. Yes, Mac wanted more, and he was about to get much more than he bargained for. Wow, my goodness. That was chapter 4, you all. Oh my God. Okay, we got to keep going. Chapter 5. Oh man, you all. Listen, if you're following with me, there are several times through that reading. That's why I got caught up in a couple of words. Several times through that reading, my eyes welled up, my heart was racing. Oh my goodness. I love the detail in this book, man, because it puts you there. It puts you there. You all keep in mind, this is a true story. Oh my God. Okay, let's keep going. Chapter 5. Guess who's coming to dinner? There's a quote here by Marilyn Robinson from The Death of Adam, and it reads, "We routinely disqualify testimony that will plead for extenuation. That is, we are so persuaded of the rightness of our judgment as to invalidate evidence that does not confirm us in it. Nothing that deserves to be called truth could ever be arrived at by such means." Okay? There are times when you choose to believe something that would normally be considered absolutely irrational. It doesn't mean that it is actually irrational, but it surely is not rational. Perhaps there is super rationality, reason beyond the normal definitions of fact or database logic, something that only makes sense if you can see a bigger picture of reality. Maybe that is where faith fits in. Mac wasn't sure about a lot of things, but at some times in his heart and mind, during the days following his tiff with the icy driveway, he became convinced that there were three plausible explanations for the note. It was either from God, as absurd as that sounded, a cruel joke, or something more sinister from Missy's killer. Regardless, the note dominated his thoughts every waking minute and his dreams at night. Secretly, he began to make plans to travel to the shack the following weekend. At first, he told no one, not even Nan. He had no reasonable defense in any exchange that would result after such a disclosure, and he was afraid that he might get locked up and the key thrown away. Anyway, he rationalized such a conversation would only bring more pain with no resolution. I am keeping it to myself for Nan's sake, he told himself. Besides, acknowledging the note would mean admitting that he had kept secrets from her. Secrets he still justified in his own mind. Sometimes honesty can be incredibly messy. Convinced of the rightness of his impending journey, Mac began to consider ways to get the family away from home for the weekend without rousing any suspicions. There was the slim possibility that the killer was trying to lure him out of town, leaving the family unprotected, and that was not acceptable. But he was stumped. Nan was too perceptive for him to show his hand in any way, and doing so would just lead to questions that he was not ready to answer. Fortunately for Mac, it was Nan herself who proffered a solution. She had been toying with the idea of visiting her sister and family up in the San Juan Islands off the coast of Washington. Her brother in law was a child psychologist, and Nan thought that getting his insights on Kate's increasingly antisocial behavior might be very helpful, especially since neither she nor Mac were having any success getting through to her. When she brought up the possibility of a trip, Mac was almost too eager in his response. Of course you are going, was his reaction when Nan told him. That was not the reply she had anticipated, and she gave him a quizzical look. I mean, he floundered. I think that's a great idea. I will miss you all, of course, but I think I can survive alone for a couple days, and I have lots to do anyway. She shrugged it off, perhaps grateful that the path for her to leave had opened so easily. I just think it would be good for Kate, especially to get away for a few days, she added, and he nodded in agreement. A quick call to Nan's sister, and their trip was set. The house soon became a whirlwind of activity. Josh and Kate were both delighted. This would extend their spring break for a week. They loved visiting their cousins and were an easy sell on the whole idea. Not that they really had any choice in the matter. On the sly, Mac called up Willie, and while trying rather unsuccessfully not to divulge too much information, asked if he could borrow his friend's four-wheel drive Jeep, since Nan was taking the van. He needed something better than his own little car to negotiate the pitted roads in the reserve, which would most likely still be buried in winter's grip. Mac's odd request predictably started a barrage of questions from Willie, questions that Mac tried to answer as evasively as he could. When Willie bluntly asked if Mac's intention was a trip to the shack, Mac told him that while he could not answer his question at that moment, he would explain fully when Willie came over in the morning to exchange the vehicles. Late Thursday afternoon, Mac saw Nan, Kate, and Josh off with hugs and kisses all around. And then he slowly began his own preparations for the long drive to northeastern Oregon, to the place of his nightmares. He reasoned that he wouldn't need much if God had sent the invitation, but just in case, he loaded up a cooler with much more than enough than for the miles he would be traveling, and then added a sleeping bag, some candles, matches, and a number of other survival items. There was no doubt the possibility that he had turned into a complete idiot or was the butt of some ugly prank, but he would then be free to just drive away. A knock at the door startled Mac from his concentration, and he could see that it was Willie. Their conversation must have been sufficiently perplexing to warrant an early visit. Mac was just relieved that Nan had already left. I'm in here, Willie, in the kitchen, Mac called out. A moment later, Willie poked his head around the hall corner and shook his head, looking at the mess that Mac had made. He leaned against the door jamb and crossed his arms. Well, I brought the Jeep and it's full of gas, but I am not handing over the keys until you tell me exactly what is going on. Mack continued piling things into a couple of bags for a trip. He knew it was no use lying to his friend, and he needed the Jeep. I'm going back to the shack, Willie. Well, I figured that much out already. What I want to know is why you even want to go back there, especially at this time of year. I don't know if my OG will even keep us on the road up there, but just in case, I put some change in the back if we need them. Without looking at him, Mac walked into the office, pried the lid off the small tin box, and took out the note. Re-entering the kitchen, he handed it to Willie. His friend unfolded the paper and read it silently. Geez, what kind of loony kook would write you something like this? And who is this Papa? Well, Papa, Nan's favorite name for God. Max shrugged, not sure what else to say. He took back the note and slid it into his shirt pocket. Wait, you aren't thinking this is really from God, are you? Max stopped and turned to face him. He had just finished packing anyway. Willie, I'm not sure what to think about this. I mean, at first I thought it was just a hoax, and it made me angry and sick to my stomach. Maybe I'm just losing it. I know it sounds crazy, but somehow I feel strangely drawn to find out for sure. I gotta go, Willie, or it'll drive me nuts forever. Have you thought of the possibility that this might be the killer? What if he's luring you back for some reason? Of course I've thought of that. Part of me won't be disappointed if it is. I have a score to settle with him, he said grimly and paused. But that doesn't make a lot of sense either. I'm not thinking the killer would sign his note Papa. You'd have to really know our family to come up with that. Willie was perplexed. Matt continued, and no one who knows us that well would ever send a note like this. I'm thinking only God would, maybe, but God doesn't do stuff like that. At least I've never heard of him sending someone a note. Not that he couldn't, but you know what I mean. And why would he want you to return to the shack anyway? I can't think of a worse place. The silence that hung between them grew awkward. Mac leaned back against the counter and stared a hole through the floor before speaking. I'm not sure, Willie. I guess part of me would like to believe that God would care enough about me to send a note. I'm so confused, even after all of this. I just don't know what to think, and it isn't getting better. I feel like we're losing Kate, and that's killing me. Maybe what happened to Missy is God's judgment for what I did to my own dad. I just don't know. He looked up into the face of a man who cared more about him than anyone he knew, except Nan. All I know is that I need to go back. There was a silence between them before Willie spoke again. So, when do we leave? Mac was touched by his friend's willingness to jump into his insanity. Thanks, buddy, but I really need to do this alone. I thought you'd say that, Willie responded as he turned and walked out the room. He returned a few moments later with a pistol and a box of shells in his hand. He gently laid them on the counter. I figured I wouldn't be able to talk you out of going, so I thought you might need this. I believe you know how to use it. Mac looked at the gun. He knew Willie meant well and was trying to help. Willie, I can't. It's been 30 years since I last touched a gun, and I don't intend to now. If I learned anything back then, it was that using violence to solve a problem always landed me in a worse problem. But what if it was Missy's killer? What if he's waiting for you up there? What are you going to do then? He shrugged. I honestly don't know, Willie. I'll take my chances, I guess. But you'll be defenseless. There's no telling what he has in mind or in hand. Just take it, Mac. Willie slid the pistol and shells across the counter toward him. You don't have to use it. Mac looked down at the gun and, after some deliberation, reached slowly for it and shells, putting them carefully in his pocket. Okay, just in case. He then turned to pick up some of his equipment and, arms loaded, headed out toward the Jeep. Willie grabbed the large duffel bag remaining. finding it heavier than he had anticipated, and grunted as he hoisted it. Geez, Mac, if you think God is going to be up there, why all the supplies? Mac smiled rather sadly. I just thought I'd cover my bases, be prepared for whatever happens or doesn't. They made their way out of the house to the driveway where the Jeep sat. Willie pulled the car keys out of his pocket and handed them to Mac. So, Willie broke the silences. Where is everybody? And what did Nan think of you heading out to the shack? I can't imagine she was real pleased. Nan and the kids are visiting her sister up in the islands, and I didn't tell her, Mac confessed. Willie was obviously surprised. What? You never keep secrets from her. I can't believe you lied to her. I didn't lie to her, Mac objected. Well, excuse me for splitting hairs, Willie snapped back. Okay, you didn't lie to her because you didn't tell her the whole truth. Oh, yeah, she's going to understand that all right. He rolled his eyes. Mac ignored the outburst and walked back to the house and into his office. There, he found the spare set of keys for his car and home, and hesitating for just a moment, picked up the small tin box. He then headed back out toward Willie. So, what do you think he looks like? Chuckled Willie as he approached. Who? Asked Mac. God, of course. What do you think he'll look like? If he even bothers to show up. I mean, boy, I can just see you scaring the living daylights out of some poor hiker, asking if he's God and then demanding answers and all. Mac grinned at the thought. I don't know. Maybe he's a really bright light or a burning bush. I've always sort of pictured him as a really big grandpa with a long white flowing beard, sort of like Gandalf in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. He shrugged and handed Willie his keys, and they exchanged a brief hug. Willie climbed in Mac's car and rolled down the driver's window. Well, if he does show, say hi for me, Willie said with a smile. Tell him I have a few questions of my own. And Mac, try not to piss him off. They both laughed. Seriously, Willie continued, I am concerned for you, buddy. I wish I was going with you, or Nan, or someone. I hope you will find everything you need up there. I'll be saying a prayer too for you. Thanks, Willie. I love you too. He waved as Willie backed out of the driveway. Mac knew that his friend would keep his word. He probably could use all the prayers he could get. He watched until Willie was around the corner and out of sight, then slipped the note from his shirt pocket, read it one more time, and then placed it into the little tin box, which he deposited on the passenger seat amongst some of the other gear stacked there. Locking the doors, he headed back into the house and a sleepless night. Well, before dawn on Friday, Mac was already out of town and traveling down I-84. Nan had called the night before from her sisters to let him know that they had made it safe and sound, and he didn't expect to get another call until at least Sunday. By that time, he would probably be on his way back, if he wasn't home already. He forwarded the house phone to his cell, just in case. Not that he would have any reception once he was into the reserve. He retraced the same path they had taken 3.5 years before, with a few minor changes, not as many potty breaks, and he sailed by Multnomah Falls without looking. He had pushed away any thoughts of the place where since Missy's disappearance, sequestering his emotions securely in the padlocked basement of his own heart. On the long stretch up the gorge, Mac felt a creeping panic begin to penetrate his consciousness. He had tried to avoid thinking about what he was doing, and just keep putting one foot in front of the other. But like grass pushing through concrete, the repressed feelings and fears somehow began to poke through. His eyes darkened and his hands tightened on the steering wheel as he fought the temptation at every off ramp to turn around and go home. He knew he was driving straight into the center of his pain, the vortex of the great sadness that had so diminished his sense of being alive. Flashes of visual memory and stabbing instances of blistering fury now came in waves, attended by the taste of bile and blood in his mouth. He finally reached La Grande, where he gassed up and then took Highway 82 out to Joseph. He was half tempted to stop and look in on Tommy, but decided against it. The fewer people who thought he was a raving lunatic, the better. Instead, he topped off his tank and headed out. Traffic was light, and the Amnaha and smaller roads were remarkably clear and dry for this time of the year, much warmer than he had expected. But it seemed that the farther he drove, the slower he traveled, as if the shack were somehow repelling his approach. The Jeep crossed the snow line as he climbed the last couple of miles to the trail that would take him down to the shack. Above the whine of the engine, he could hear the tires crunch doggedly through the deepening snow and ice. Even after a couple of wrong turns and some backtracking, it was only early afternoon when Mack finally pulled over and parked at the barely visible trail ahead. He sat there for almost 5 minutes, reprimanding himself for being such a fool. With every mile he had traveled from Joseph, the memories had come back with adrenaline clarity, and now he was mentally certain that he wanted to go no further. But the inner compulsion to press on was irresistible. Even as he argued with himself, he buttoned up his coat and reached for his leather gloves. He stood and stared down the path, deciding to leave everything in the car and hike the mile or so down to the lake. At least that way he wouldn't have to lug everything back up the hill when he returned to leave, which he now expected would be in very short order. It was cold enough that his breath hung in the air around him, and it even felt like it might snow. The pain that had been building in his stomach finally pushed up into panic. After only 5 steps, he stopped and retched so strongly that it brought him to his knees. Please help me, he groaned. He stood up on shaky legs and took another step away from the car. Then he stopped and turned back. He opened the passenger door and reached in, rummaging around until he felt the small tin box. He pried the lid off and found what he was looking for, his favorite picture of Missy, which he removed along with the note. Replacing the lid, he left the box on the seat. He paused for a moment looking at the glove box. Finally, he opened it and grabbed Willie's gun, checking to make sure it was loaded and the safety was on. Standing up, he closed the door, reached under his coat, and stuck the gun in his belt in the small of his back. He turned and faced the path once more, taking one last look at Missy's picture before sliding it into his shirt pocket alongside the note. If they found him dead, at least they would know who had been on his mind. The trail was treacherous, the rocks icy and slippery. Every step took concentration as he descended into the thickening forest. It was eerily quiet. The only sounds he could hear were the crunch of his steps on the snow and the heaviness of his breathing. Max started feeling like he was being watched, and once he even spun around quickly to see if anyone was there. As much as he wanted to turn and run back to the Jeep, his feet seemed to have a will of their own, determined to continue down the path and deeper into the dimly lit and increasingly dense woods. Suddenly, something moved close by. Startled, he froze, silent and alert, with his heart pounding in his ears and his mouth suddenly dry. He slowly reached behind his back, sliding the pistol from his belt. Snapping off the safety, he peered intensely into the dark underbush, trying to see or hear anything that might explain the noise and slow the rush of adrenaline. But whatever had moved had now stopped. Was it waiting for him? Just in case, he stood motionless for a few minutes before he again began inching his way farther down the trail, trying to be as quiet as possible. The forest seemed to close in around him, and he began to seriously wonder if he had taken the wrong path. Out of the corner of his eye, he again saw movement and instantly crouched down, peering between the low branches of a nearby tree. Something ghostly, like a shadow, slipped into the bush. Or had he only imagined it? Again he waited, not shifting a muscle. Was that God? He doubted it. Maybe an animal. He couldn't remember if there were wolves up here, or deer or elk would make more noise. And then he thought he had been avoiding. He thought he had been, and then the thought, okay, he had been avoiding. What if it was worse? What if he had been lured up here? But for what? Slowly rising from his hiding place, gun still drawn, he took a step forward. Then suddenly the bush behind him began to explode, seemed to explode. Mack whipped around, scared and ready to fight for his life. But before he could squeeze the trigger, he recognized the rear near of a badger scampering back to the trail. He slowly exhaled the breath he had realized he had been holding, lowered his gun, and shook his head. Mac the Courageous had been reduced to just another scared boy in the woods. Snapping the safety back on, he tucked the gun away. Someone could get hurt, he thought with a sigh of relief. Taking another deep breath and exhaling slowly, he calmed himself. Determined that he was done being afraid, he continued down the path, trying to look more confident than he felt. He hoped he hadn't come all this way for nothing. If God was really meeting him here, he was more than ready to get a few things off his chest, respectfully, of course. A few turns later, he stumbled out of the woods and into a clearing. At the far side of down the slope, he saw it again, the shack. He stood staring at it, his stomach a ball of motion and turmoil. On the surface, it seemed that nothing had changed other than the winter stripping of the deciduous trees and the white shroud of snow that blanketed the surroundings. The shack itself looked dead and empty. But as he stared it seemed for a moment to transform into an evil face, twisted in some demonic grimace, looking straight back at him and daring him to approach. Ignoring the rising panic he was feeling, Mac walked with resolve down the last 100 yards and up onto the porch. The memories and horror of the last time he stood at this door came flooding back, and he hesitated before pushing it open. "Hello?" he called, not too loudly. Clearing his throat, he called again, this time louder. "Hello? Anybody here?" His voice echoed off the emptiness inside. Feeling bolder, he stepped completely across the threshold and stopped. As his eyes adjusted in the dimness, he began to make out the details of the room by afternoon light filtering in through the broken windows. Stepping into the main room, he recognized the old chairs and table. Mac couldn't help himself as his eyes were drawn to the one place he could not bear to look, even after a few years. The faded bloodstains were still clearly visible in the wood near the fireplace where they had found Missy's dress. "I'm so sorry, honey." Tears began to well up in his eyes. And finally, his heart exploded like a flash flood, releasing his pent up anger and letting it rush down the rocky canyons of his emotion. Turning his eyes heavenward, he began screaming his anguished questions. "Why? Why did you let this happen? Why did you bring me here? Of course, all the places to meet you. Why here? Wasn't it enough to kill my baby? Do you have to toy with me too?" In a blind rage, Mac grabbed the nearest chair and flung it at the window. It smashed into pieces. He picked up one of the legs and began destroying everything he could. Groans and moans of despair and fury spat through his lips as he beat his wrath into this terrible place. "I hate you!" In a frenzy, he pounded out his rage until he was exhausted and spent. Despairing and defeated, Max slumped to the floor next to the bloodstain. He touched it carefully. This was all that was left of his Missy. As he lay next to her, his fingers tenderly traced the discolored edges, and softly he whispered, "Missy, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I couldn't find you." Even in his exhaustion, the anger seethed, and once again took aim at the indifferent God he imagined somewhere beyond the roof of the shack. "God, you couldn't even let us find her and bury her properly? Was that just too much to ask?" As the mix of emotions ebbed and flowed, his anger giving way to pain, a fresh wave of sorrow began to mix with his confusion. So where are you? I thought you wanted to meet me here. Well, I'm here, God, and you? You're nowhere to be found. You've never been around when I've needed you. Not when I was a little boy, not when I lost Missy, not now. Some papa you are. He spat out the words. Max sat there in silence. The emptiness of the place invaded his soul. His jumble of unanswered questions and far flung accusations settled to the floor with him, and then slowly drained into a pit of desolation. The great sadness tightened around him, and he almost welcomed the smothering sensation. This pain he knew. He was familiar with it, almost like a friend. Mac could feel the gun in the small of his back, an inviting cold pressed against his skin. He pulled it out, not sure what he was going to do. Oh, to stop caring, to stop feeling the pain, to never feel anything again. Suicide? At the moment, that option was almost attractive. It would be so easy, he thought. No more tears, no more pain. He could almost see a black chasm opening up in the floor behind the gun he was staring at, a darkness sucking any last vestiges of hope from his heart. Killing himself would be one way to strike back at God, if God even existed. Clouds parted outside, and the sunbeam suddenly spilled into the room, piercing the center of his despair. But what about Nan? And what about Josh and Kate, or Tyler and John? As much as he longed to stop the ache in his heart, he knew he could not add to their heart. Max sat in his emotionally spent stupor, weighing the options in the feel of the gun. A cold breeze brushed past his face, and part of him wanted to just lie down and freeze to death. He was so exhausted. He slumped back against the wall and rubbed his weary eyes. He let them fall closed as he mumbled, I love you, Missy. I miss you so much. Soon he drifted without effort into dead sleep. It was probably only moments later when Mac woke with a jerk. Surprised, he nodded off. He stood quickly, stuffing the gun back into his waistband and his anger back into the deepest part of his soul. He started to the door. This is ridiculous. I'm such an idiot. To think that I hope God might actually care enough to send me a note. He looked up into the open rafters. I'm done, God, he whispered. I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of trying to find you in all of this. And with that, he walked out the door. Mac determined that this was the last time he would go looking for God. If God wanted him, God would have to come find him. He reached into his pocket and took out the note he had found in his mailbox and tore it into little pieces, letting it slowly sift through his fingers, to be carried off by the cold wind that had kicked up. A weary old man, he stepped off the porch and with heavy footsteps and a heavier heart started the hike back to the car. He had barely walked 50 feet up the trail when he felt a sudden rush of warm air overtake him from behind. The chirping of a songbird broke the icy silence. The path in front of him rapidly lost its veneer of ice and snow, as if someone were blowing dry. Max stopped and watched as all around him the white covering dissolved and was replaced with emerging and radiant growth. 3 weeks of spring unfurled before him in 30 seconds. He rubbed his eyes and steadied himself in a swirl of activity. Even the light snow that had begun to fall had changed to tiny blossoms lazily drifted to the ground. What he was seeing, of course, was not possible. The snowbanks had vanished, and summer wildflowers began to color the borders of the trail and into the forest as far as he could see. Robins and finches darted after one another among the trees. Squirrels and chipmunks occasionally crossed the path ahead, some stopping to sit up and watch him for a moment before plunging back into the undergrowth. He even thought that he glimpsed a young buck emerging out of a dark glade in the forest. But on a second look, it was gone. As if that weren't enough, the scent of blooms began to fill the air. Not just the drifting aroma of wild mountain flowers, but the richness of roses and orchids and other exotic fragrances found in more tropical climes. Mac was no longer thinking about home. A terror gripped him, as if he had opened up Pandora's box and was being swept away into the center of madness to be lost forever. Unsteady, he carefully turned around, trying to hold on to some sense of sanity. He was stunned. Little, if anything, was the same. The dilapidated shack had been replaced by a sturdy and beautifully constructed log cabin, now standing directly between him and the lake, which he could see just above the rooftop. It was built out and hand peeled full length logs, every one scribed for a perfect fit. Instead of the dark and forbidding overgrowth of bush, briars, and devil's club, everything that Matt could see was now postcard perfect. Smoke was lazily wending its way from the chimney into the late afternoon sky, a sign of activity inside. A walkway had been built to and around the front porch, bordered by a small white picket fence. The sound of laughter was coming from nearby, maybe inside, but he wasn't sure. Perhaps this is what it was like to experience a complete psychotic break. I'm losing it, Mac whispered to himself. This can't be happening. This isn't real. It was a place where Mac could only have imagined in his best dreams, and this made it all the more suspect. The sights were wondrous, the scents intoxicating, and his feet, as if they had a mind of their own, took him back down the walkway and up onto the front porch. Flowers bloomed everywhere, and the mix of floral fragrances and pungent herbs aroused hints of memories long forgotten. He had always heard that the nose was the best link to the past, that the olfactory sense was the strongest for tapping into forgotten history. And now some long stored remembrances of his own childhood flitted through his mind. Once on the porch, he stopped again. Voices were clearly coming from inside. Mac rejected the sudden impulse to run away, as if he were some kid who had thrown his ball into a neighbor's flower garden. But if God is inside, it wouldn't do much good anyway, would it? He closed his eyes and shook his head to see if he could erase the hallucination and restore reality. But when he opened them, it was all still there. He tentatively reached out and touched the wood railing. It certainly seemed real. He now faced another dilemma. What should you do when you come to the door of a house or a cabin in this case where God might be? Should you knock? Presumably God already knew that Mac was there. Maybe he ought to simply walk in and introduce himself. But that seemed equally absurd. And how should he address him? Should he call him Father or Almighty One or perhaps Mr. God? Would it be best if he fell down and worshipped? Not that he was really in the mood. As he tried to establish some inner mental balance, the anger that he thought had so recently died inside him began to emerge. No longer concerned or caring about what to call God, and energized by his ire, he walked up to the door. Mac decided to bang loudly and see what happened. But just as he raised his fist to do so, the door flew open, and he was looking directly into the face of a large, beaming African American woman. Instinctively, he jumped back, but he was too slow. With speed and belied her size, she crossed the distance between them and engulfed him in her arms, lifting him clear off his feet and spinning him around like a little child. And all the while she was shouting his name, Mackenzie Allen Philips, with the ardor of someone seeing a long lost and deeply loved relative. She finally put him back on earth and with her hands on his shoulders, pushed him back as if to take a good look at him. Mac, look at you, she fairly exploded. Here you are, so grown up. I've really been looking forward to see you face to face. It is so wonderful to have you here with us. My, how I do love you. And with that, she wrapped herself around him again. Mac was speechless. In a few words, this woman had breached pretty much every social propriety behind which he had so safely entrenched himself. But something in the way that she looked at him and yelled his name made him equally delighted to see her too, even though he didn't have a clue who she was. Suddenly, he was overwhelmed by the scent emanating from her, and it took him. It was the smell of flowers with overtones of gardenia and jasmine, unmistakably his mother's perfume that she kept hidden away he kept hidden away in his little tin box. He had already been perched precariously on the precipice of emotion, and now the flooding scent and attendant memory staggered him. He could feel the warmth of tears beginning to gather behind his eyes, as if they were knocking on the door of his heart. It seemed that she saw them too. It's okay, honey. You can let it all out. I know you've been hurt, and I know you're angry and confused. So go ahead and let it out. And it does a good soul. It does a soul good to let the waters run once in a while, the healing waters. While Mac could not stop the tears from filling his eyes, he was not ready to let go. Not yet. Not with this woman. With every effort he could muster, he kept himself from falling back into the black hole of his emotions. Meanwhile, this woman stood there with her arms outstretched as if they were the very arms of his mother. He felt the presence of love. It was warm, inviting, melting. Not ready, she responded. That's okay. We'll do things on your terms and time. Well, come in. Can I take your coat and that gun? You don't really need that, do you? We wouldn't want anyone to get hurt, would we? Mac wasn't sure what to do or what to say. Who was she? And how did she know? He was rooted to the spot where he stood, but slowly and mechanically took off his coat. The large black woman gathered his coat and he handed her the gun, which she took from him with two fingers as if it was contaminated. Just as she turned to enter the cabin, a small, distinctively Asian woman emerged from behind her. Here, let me take those. Her voice sang. Obviously, she had not meant the coat or the gun, but something else. And she was in front of him in a blink of an eye. He stiffened as he felt something sweep gently across his cheek. Without moving, he looked down and could see that she was busy with a fragile crystal bottle and a small brush, like those he had seen Nan and Kate use for makeup, gently removing something from his face. Before he could act, she smiled and whispered, Mackenzie, we all have things we value enough to collect, don't we? His little tin box flashed through his mind. I collect tears. As she stepped back, Mac found himself involuntarily squinting in her direction, as if doing so would allow his eyes to see her better. But strangely, he still had a difficult time focusing on her. She seemed almost to shimmer in the light, and her hair blew in all directions, even though there was hardly a breeze. It was almost easier to see her out of the corner of his eye than it was to look at her directly. He then glanced past her and noticed that a third person had emerged from the cabin. This one, a man. He appeared Middle Eastern and was dressed like a laborer, complete with tool belt and gloves. He stood easily, leaning against the door jamb with arms crossed in front of him, wearing jeans covered in wood dust and a plaid shirt with sleeves rolled just above the elbows, revealing well-muscled forearms. His features were pleasant enough, but he was not particularly handsome, not a man who would stick out in a crowd. But his eyes and smile lit up his face, and Mac found it difficult to look away. Mac stepped back again, feeling a bit overwhelmed. Are there more of you? He asked a little hoarsely. The three looked at one another and laughed. Mac couldn't help but smile. No, Mackenzie, chuckled the black woman. We is all that you get, and believe me, we're more than enough. Mac tried again to look at the Asian woman. From what he could tell, this wiry looking person was maybe of northern Chinese or Nepalese or even Mongolian ethnicity. It was hard to tell because his eyes had to work to see her at all. From her clothing, Mac assumed she was a groundskeeper or gardener. She had gloves folded into her belt, not the heavy leathers of the man, but the lightweight cloth and rubber ones that Mac himself used for yard work at home. She was dressed in plain jeans with ornamental designs at the fringes, knees covered in dirt from where she had been kneeling, and a brightly colored blouse with splashes of yellow and red and blue. But he knew all this as more but he knew all this as more an impression of her than from actually seeing her, as she seemed to phase in and out of his vision. The man then stepped in, touched Mac on the shoulder, gave him a kiss on both cheeks, and embraced him strongly. Mac knew instantly that he liked him. As they separated, the man stepped back, and the Asian lady moved toward him again, this time taking his face in both hands. Gradually and intentionally, she moved her face closer to his, and just when he imagined she was going to kiss him, she stopped and looked deep in his eyes. Mac thought he could almost see through her. Then she smiled, and her scents seemed to wrap themselves around him and lift a huge weight off his shoulders, as if he had been carting his gear in a backpack. Mac suddenly felt lighter than air, almost as if he were no longer touching the ground. She was hugging him without hugging him, or really without even touching him. Only when she pulled back, which was probably just seconds later, did he realize that he was still standing on his feet and that his feet were still touching the deck. Oh, don't mind her, the big black woman laughed. She has that effect on everyone. I like it, he muttered, and all three burst into more laughter, and now Mac found himself laughing along with them, not knowing exactly why or not really caring either. When they finally stopped giggling, the large woman put her arm around Mac's shoulders, drew him to her, and said, "Okay, we know who you are, but we should probably introduce ourselves to you. She waved her hands with a flourish, am the housekeeper and cook. You may call me Alucia." "Alucia?" asked Mac, not comprehending at all. "Okay, you don't have to call me Alucia. It is just a name I am rather fond of and has particular meaning to me. So," she crossed her arms and put one hand under her chin as if thinking especially hard. "You could call me what Nan does." "What? You don't mean—" Now Mac was surprised and even more confused. Surely this was not the papa who sent the note. I mean, are you saying Papa? "Yes," she responded and smiled, waiting for him to speak as if he were about to say something, which he was not at all. "And I," interrupted the man, who looked to be about his in his 30s and stood a little shorter than Mac himself. "I try to keep things fixed up around here. I enjoy working with my hands, although, as these two will tell you, I take pleasure in cooking and gardening as much as they do." "As you look as if you're from the Middle East, maybe Arab," Mac guessed. "Actually, I'm a stepbrother of that great family. I am Hebrew, to be exact, from the house of Judah." Then Mac was suddenly staggered by his own realization. "Then you are Jesus?" "Yes, and you may call me that if you like. After all, it has become my common name. My mother called me Yeshua, but I have also been known to respond to Joshua or even Jesse." Max stood dumbfounded and mute. What he was looking at and listening to simply would not compute. It was all so impossible. But here he was, or was he really here at all? Suddenly he felt faint. Emotion swept over him as his mind attempted desperately to catch up with all the information. Just as he was about to crumble to his knees, the Asian woman stepped closer and deflected his attention. "And I am Sarayu," she said as she tilted her head in a slight bow and smiled. "Keeper of the gardens, among other things." Thoughts tumbled over each other as Max struggled to figure out what to do. Was one of these people God? What if they were hallucinations or angels, or God was coming later? That could be embarrassing. Since there were three of them, maybe this was a trinity sort of thing, but two women and a man, and none of them white. Then again, why had he naturally assumed that God would be white? He knew his mind was rambling, so he focused on the one question he most wanted answers. Then Max struggled to ask, which one of you is God? I am, said all three in unison. Mac looked from one to the next, and even though he couldn't begin to grasp what he was seeing and hearing, he somehow believed them. And that concludes chapter 5. That is so good. Oh my God, you all. That is so good. Oh, I'm excited about it. Oh my goodness, that was so good. Oh, that was a lot. That was a lot. As he was driving to the shack, I'm telling you now, the anticipation, the adrenaline, the heart pacing, everything that he felt, I felt in my body. Do you hear me? I'm telling you to try to feel all of this stuff. I'm a huge empath, so I feel everything, okay? But to feel all of this stuff while trying to maintain good reading, it is a challenge. I tell you what, okay? Listen, you all, that was the end of chapter 5. So come Tuesday, we're going to be reading chapters 6 and 7, okay? Chapter 6 and 7. So chapter 6 is a piece of pie. And the pie, if you know math and you like math, I like math. I love math actually. It is not just PIE, it's PI, or the pi symbol in math, which is 3.14. Okay? Pie, the piece of pie. That's chapter 6. And then chapter 7 is God on the dock. God on the dock. Oh my goodness. It is getting interesting, you all. So he made it to the shack, and the shack has turned into this beautiful place where the chimney is smoking, and the outside that was cold and icy now it's springtime. Okay, all of these. Oh my goodness, y'all keep in mind this story is based on true events. That's what makes it wild. I said after we finished reading this book, you all, I said I was going to watch the movie because I saw the movie. I had to be a teenager, okay? Either late teens or maybe even early 20s. I'll even give it that. So you're talking about well over 20 years ago, okay? I don't recall. I do recall Papa being a black woman, and it was played by Octavia Jones. I do remember that, but as far as like any details of the movie, I can't even tell them to you. I don't know. But I'm me reading this book, I'm like, oh my God, it is so wild. It's so wild. So we get to live vicariously through Mackenzie's story as told by William. Well, as written by William, as told by Mackenzie. Okay. So y'all, I am excited. So if you do not have this book, if you do not have this book, get the book, okay? I have it for you free of charge. You know, I am a nonprofit organization, so donations are welcome, but they are not required for you to get the reading materials that we read in any of our reading sessions, okay? So if you want the book, email me. You can email me at info@biancamissbylee.com, okay? info@biancamissbylee.com. We have viewers from everywhere, you all. We have viewers listening from Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. Oh my goodness, you all. Listen, thank you so very much for being here. And at any time that we're in session, you all, if you want to share on your pages, perfectly fine, you know. But listen, get the book so that you can have it and you can read along with us as I'm reading, right? Email me info@biancamissbylee.com. Okay. If you want to stay up on the books that we're reading, or even the transits, cosmic transits and things like that, or see some services that I offer or merchandise that I have, go to my website. It's right there on the screen. For those on Clubhouse, it's right above my head. You can just tap above my head and you'll be right there on the screen. Go to the website right there, BiancaMissBeLee.com. Okay. And then follow me on social media, you all: Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Clubhouse, Twitter, all of those things. You will find me at Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee. Okay. Find me there. I'm telling you, you don't want to miss anything that we're doing together. Listen, I'm just full. I'm full. This book is amazing. Oh my goodness, y'all. Okay. So we started at 5 Eastern. It is now almost 7, so that's about 2 hours. That's a good enough time. I don't want to keep you any longer, although this was amazing, absolutely amazing. Okay. Oof, I don't go ahead of you all, so I'm on the edge of my seat right with you. Okay. So we'll reconvene Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. I try to get you all in after you kind of settled down, got dinner, got the kids settled and all of that stuff. And, so you can kind of listen in while you're kind of winding down for the night. So Tuesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, okay? At 7 Central, that is 5 Pacific, okay? So be here, be here, be here. Until then, you all, I love you. I mean it. There's absolutely positively nothing you can do about it. Don't you even try it. We'll see you back here Tuesday night, right here at Divine Femininity United. Peace.